Welcome to Group, where we explore the hidden psychology behind relationships, emotional patterns, and the power of becoming your strongest, most self-aware version. What happens when you stop chasing someone who is used to your constant presence? What happens when your silence is no longer a reaction, but a sign of true inner transformation? In this video, we uncover the hidden psychology of no contact with an avoidant and why your emotional shift can change the entire dynamic. Because the greatest change does not happen when they finally notice you, it happens when you finally return to yourself. Being in no contact with an avoidant person can feel like being trapped in an emotional pause. There is no explanation, no clear ending, and no answers to the questions constantly running through your mind. Do they miss you? Do they think about what happened? Do they feel your absence? The truth is that avoidant individuals often have unconscious expectations during periods of distance. And the way you handle this time can either rebuild your confidence or reveal that the connection was still built around emotional imbalance. The first thing to understand is that real no contact is not simply about refusing to send a message. It is not just physical silence. It is an internal decision to detach emotionally. Many people believe they are practicing no contact because they stopped reaching out, but their mind is still completely connected. They check updates, revisit old conversations, imagine what they would say if the person returned, or share things hoping they will notice. That is not true distance. The connection is still being emotionally maintained. Avoidant individuals may not openly respond to emotional pressure, but they often sense when someone is still attached. When they feel that you are still waiting, still hoping, or still available emotionally, the space they created never becomes real. True no contact means your focus returns to yourself. Your attention is no longer centered around what they are doing, what they are thinking, or when they might come back. It is about reclaiming your own emotional energy. And this is where the dynamic begins to change. When you genuinely release your attachment, not as a tactic, but because you choose yourself, your absence becomes something real. It is no longer a performance. It is no longer silence designed to create a reaction. It becomes a natural result of personal growth. This is not about making someone miss you through manipulation. It is about reaching a place where their distance no longer controls your emotional state. When someone has become accustomed to having access to your attention, even from far away, they never fully experience what your absence means. But when you step away without anger, without dramatic gestures, and without trying to be noticed, you create a space they can no longer ignore. At first, an avoidant person may actually feel relief. Distance often feels comfortable because it removes emotional intensity. But as time passes and you do not return to the old pattern, something can begin to shift. Certainty can turn into curiosity. They may start wondering why things feel different, why you are no longer reaching out, why the usual cycle has stopped. Not because you are chasing their attention, but because you are no longer constantly available for it. This is why consistency matters. If you break no contact because you feel lonely, anxious, or overwhelmed, the old pattern returns. The avoidant person may unconsciously learn that distance always ends with you coming back. The cycle remains predictable. But when you maintain your boundaries, stop checking, stop creating indirect contact, and stop looking for ways to remain connected, you step outside that emotional orbit completely. That is when the other person has the opportunity to experience your absence. This is not punishment, it is self-respect. Real detachment means you are no longer waiting for a message. You are no longer rehearsing conversations in your mind. You are no longer building your emotional world around whether they choose you or not. Your life begins moving forward because you are no longer stuck in emotional suspension. And ironically, this is where your power returns. The greatest transformation that comes from no contact is not simply disappearing from someone's life. It is becoming someone whose life continues expanding without needing their presence. Avoidant people often notice authenticity more than words. They may not respond to explanations, but they can sense when someone's identity has genuinely changed. Forced happiness, attention-seeking posts, or attempts to prove you are moving on often reveal the opposite. They show that your focus is still connected to them. Real change is quieter. It looks like developing yourself because you want to grow, building friendships because they bring you joy, learning new things because they inspire you, becoming calmer because you have healed your relationship with yourself. Those changes create a different kind of impact because they are not performed. They are real. And this can create a powerful realization for someone who once assumed your availability would always remain the same. They begin noticing that the version of you they once had easy access to is changing. The important part is that this shift cannot be created through strategy. It only has meaning when it comes from genuine transformation. Avoidant attachment often struggles with emotional closeness while also being drawn toward qualities like independence, stability, healthy boundaries, and emotional security. When you begin embodying those qualities naturally, the connection either has to grow to meet that level or reveal where it cannot. The biggest changes are often found in ordinary moments. You start taking care of yourself differently. You become more present around others. You stop waiting for attention that once felt necessary for your happiness. You become someone who enjoys life, whether they return or not. Over time, these small changes create a completely different energy, and that is when no contact becomes something much bigger than waiting for someone to come back. It becomes the process of becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves for someone else's attention. The deepest shift is not whether they notice your absence. The deepest shift is that you finally notice your own worth. The fear of losing someone and the fear of getting too close often exist together within avoidant attachment. The purpose of no contact is not to create emotional panic or force someone into chasing you. It is about creating enough space for reflection to happen naturally, instead of continuing the same cycle of pressure and withdrawal. This is why extreme approaches usually fail. Begging for attention often increases their desire for distance. Cutting them off with anger or resentment can make emotional separation feel easier for them. But calm, respectful, and consistent distance creates something different. It removes the emotional patterns they have become familiar with. Many people expect either pursuit or complete emotional rejection. What they do not expect is someone who can step back peacefully, without bitterness, without chasing, and without losing themselves. If they eventually reach out, the way you respond matters just as much as the silence that came before it. This is where many people accidentally return to old patterns. Some respond with coldness because they want to punish the other person. Others immediately pour out their emotions and reopen the same dynamic that created distance in the first place. The healthier approach is balance. Respond with calmness, be respectful, allow communication to exist without immediately giving away all of your emotional energy. A simple response like, "It's good to hear from you, I hope everything is going well," can communicate something powerful. It shows that your life and your emotional stability are no longer dependent on their attention. It quietly changes the dynamic because it introduces a new reality. If this connection continues, effort cannot come from only one side anymore. The true power of this approach is not about controlling another person's behavior. It is about changing your relationship with yourself. No contact becomes meaningful when it helps you rebuild emotional independence, rather than when it becomes a strategy to get a reaction. Avoidant dynamics are often affected by emotional dependence. When someone begins finding security within themselves, instead of constantly searching for reassurance from another person, that transformation becomes noticeable. It is not an act. It is a genuine internal shift. This process requires understanding your own emotional patterns, your fears, your triggers, and the reasons you may have felt the need to seek constant reassurance. As you become more aware, you learn how to comfort yourself, create healthier boundaries, and respond from self-respect rather than fear. Your entire presence begins to change. You become less reactive. You stop overanalyzing every action. You no longer feel controlled by uncertainty. Instead, you develop a quiet confidence that says, your life continues, whether someone chooses to be part of it or not. This change appears in small ways. You communicate with intention instead of urgency. You stop explaining yourself repeatedly. You become comfortable with your own company. Solitude no longer feels like rejection. It becomes a place of strength. And these changes are often noticed, not because of what you announce, but because of what you no longer do. You are no longer someone waiting around for their attention. You become someone who has their own direction, their own peace, and their own emotional foundation. That naturally changes the energy of the connection. As you develop a more secure sense of yourself, you begin realizing something important. A healthy relationship should not require endless strategies, emotional guessing games, or constant attempts to maintain someone's interest. Real emotional safety should feel stable and mutual. Whether the avoidant returns or not becomes less important because your happiness is no longer tied to their decision. The biggest transformation is when you stop trying to prove your value through reactions and become someone whose identity is not controlled by another person's presence or absence. Avoidant individuals are often familiar with being the emotionally distant person in a relationship. They may be used to others pursuing them, explaining themselves, or trying harder to create closeness. That pattern can feel predictable and comfortable. But when you stop overgiving, stop chasing, and begin showing emotional balance, the entire dynamic changes. Not because you are trying to create a reaction, but because you are no longer participating in the old pattern. This is not about playing psychological games. It is not about creating distance to make someone miss you. That mindset still places your power in their hands. The deeper purpose is reclaiming yourself. It is returning ownership of your emotions, your peace, and your attention back to where they belong. During no contact, many people struggle because they express their emotions indirectly. They post certain things hoping they will be noticed. They share messages, songs, or updates meant to send hidden signals. Others try to appear completely unaffected by creating an image of happiness that is also designed to be seen. But both behaviors come from the same place. They are still centered around the other person. True emotional independence is different. It is not pretending you feel nothing. It is simply choosing that your inner world does not need to be displayed for someone else to interpret. When you stop making your emotions available for analysis, something changes. The other person can no longer predict where you stand. They can no longer rely on the same emotional patterns they once understood. And when someone can no longer easily predict you, their perception of you begins to change. Questions naturally appear. Have they changed? Are they still waiting? Are they becoming someone different? Has something shifted that I no longer understand? This uncertainty is not about confusion or manipulation. It is simply the natural result of someone realizing that the person they once understood is no longer living from the same emotional place. And that is where the real transformation begins. They may not always show their thoughts clearly or respond in obvious ways, but many avoidant individuals pay close attention to patterns. They notice changes in behavior, shifts in energy, and differences in consistency. They recognize when your reactions are no longer centered around them, when your emotions no longer rise and fall according to their actions, and when the familiar cycle of connection, distance, and reassurance no longer continues. Even silence can communicate something. Even absence can create a different kind of awareness. Psychologically, this connects to what is known as the Zeigarnik effect, which describes how the mind often remembers incomplete or unresolved experiences more strongly than those that feel finished. When something feels unfinished, the mind naturally returns to it, searching for understanding and closure. This does not mean you should intentionally create confusion or leave things unresolved as a tactic. The deeper shift happens when you stop constantly explaining yourself, revealing every emotion, and providing endless reassurance. When every feeling is exposed and every thought is made available, the mind can quickly place the experience into a completed category. But when you step back and stop making your emotional world constantly accessible, something changes. The other person no longer receives the same familiar information they once relied on. However, the most important part of this transformation is not about creating an effect on them. It is about changing the way you relate to yourself. Avoidant individuals, like most people, can often sense the difference between someone pretending to be detached and someone who has genuinely developed emotional independence. There is a major difference between acting like you do not care and truly becoming less dependent on another person's validation. One is a performance, the other is an inner transformation. Real emotional stability does not change depending on whether someone comes closer or moves away. It does not disappear when they are silent, and it does not become desperate when they return. It remains steady because it is no longer built around another person's behavior. When this happens, the emotional environment of the connection begins to change. The old pattern of pursuing, withdrawing, waiting, and reconnecting starts losing its structure. Instead of receiving predictable emotional responses, the other person encounters something different: space. That space does not create chaos. It creates room for reflection. Without the usual emotional signals, the mind naturally begins asking questions. Has something changed? Why does this feel different now? Are they still available in the same way? Did I assume their presence would always remain? These questions are not created through manipulation. They appear because the previous pattern no longer exists. When someone has always known exactly how another person feels, there is a sense of certainty. But when those emotional signals are no longer constantly provided, the connection becomes harder to define. The shift happens quietly, not through arguments or attempts to prove a point, but through the simple fact that you are no longer offering the same access to your inner world. But the true purpose of this change is not to influence what they think. It is to free yourself from organizing your emotional life around their thoughts, reactions, or choices. This is where real independence begins. You stop searching for hidden meanings in every silence. You stop analyzing every small action. You stop changing yourself based on whether they seem close or distant. Your energy returns to you. You no longer need someone else to understand your worth before you recognize it yourself. Slowly, you begin noticing the difference between insecurity and clarity. Insecurity feels urgent. It demands answers, reassurance, and immediate resolution. Clarity feels calm. It allows you to observe, make choices, and protect your peace without constantly trying to maintain access to someone else. Your boundaries begin changing too. They are no longer created to send a message or influence someone's behavior. They become personal standards that exist because you value yourself. You stop explaining yourself repeatedly. You stop giving more than you receive. You stop trying to convince someone to offer the consistency they are not ready to provide. And this transformation reaches far beyond one connection. The emotional urgency that once controlled you begins to fade. Silence no longer feels like something that must be immediately fixed. Being alone no longer feels like something you need to escape. Your identity becomes stronger outside of being chosen, pursued, or validated. At that point, the old dynamic loses its power. Not because the other person suddenly changed, but because you are no longer built around waiting for them to decide your value. Whether they return, remain distant, or appear inconsistently no longer determines your emotional state. It may still matter, but it no longer controls you. And that is the true purpose of no contact. It was never about creating the perfect strategy, sending hidden signals, or trying to force someone to come back. It is about returning your attention, your confidence, and your emotional power back to yourself. When you stop chasing answers from someone else and begin creating peace within yourself, the entire dynamic changes naturally. The greatest outcome is not whether they return. The greatest outcome is that you return to yourself. No contact was never about controlling someone else's actions. It was about reclaiming your own peace and emotional strength. The moment you stop chasing answers and start choosing yourself, your entire energy begins to shift. Whether they return or not, you become someone who is secure, confident, and no longer defined by their absence. That is the real power of transformation, coming back to yourself. If you enjoyed this message and found value in it, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Sang, and stay connected for more insights on relationships, emotional growth, and self-mastery.